All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Wesley Holmes. I'm the Director of Strategy and Development for the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. Today, we're going to be presenting on opportunities to advance electric transportation in the Southeast. I'm sure as we're all aware, there has been a flurry of legislative activity going on over the past several months, and we finally got a very large infrastructure package that has been passed, and we're waiting for it to be signed. For our goal, SEA wants to make sure that the Southeast is successful in bringing as much of that investment opportunity into the Southeast as possible so that we can advance our regional electrification goals and grow the opportunities for electrification and transportation and all the jobs it brings to the region. So to help us make sense of that, we invited a panel of folks who kind of can represent, one, give us an understanding of what just happened, but then also some ideas about what we can do with it and how do we access this capital. So today we're joined by Nick Nigro. He's the founder of Atlas Public Policy, along with his colleague Tom Taylor, a policy analyst with Atlas Public Policy. They're going to be giving us the rundown on what happened in this bill, what all is in it, what are the different pathways of investment and the kind of levels of investment we can expect to see through this bill, as well as what's potentially coming down the pipe through other elements of the Build Back Better components. Then we're also joined by Shauna Basks. She's the communications coordinator and energy analyst for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation with their Office of Energy Programs. And she's going to be giving us some insight on what are the opportunities for state energy offices and other state agencies to advance state energy infrastructure planning and EV infrastructure build-outs using these funds. And then for a private sector perspective, we're joined by Josh Cohen. Josh is the Director of Policy for Greenlabs, a division of Shell Company. And he's going to be offering some insight on what are the opportunities for public-private partnerships and what is the role of the private sector in helping to advance some of our state, city, and otherwise local government EV infrastructure build-out opportunities. So to give all due time to unpack this massive legislation, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nick Nigro. For those of you who have questions, if you have any clarifying remarks or want to understand what was just said, please make use of the Q&A feature at the bottom bar of the screen here. We're also going to be having about a 15-minute Q&A session at the end, and if there's any specific questions we have time to get to, we'll make some time in that space. But please tailor your remarks to just clarifying remarks during presentation so we can move through them today. With that, I'll turn it over to Nick.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction and great to be here. So I'm going to give some background on the EV market and whatnot to set up Tom to go into the dirty details of the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Act. So before I get into some of those details, I just want to give a little background on Atlas, the company. So we started Atlas back in 2015. We are mostly based in DC. We also have some folks on the West Coast. We are working with a number of public agencies across the country, including Shauna's agency in Tennessee, some federal agencies and local governments, along with nonprofits, foundations, and companies around bringing data to the policymaking space. So our customers are those government agencies. We also work with Josh's group and other leaders in the space. We do a lot of work in electric transportation, which is what we're focused on here today. But we also work in buildings and other spaces of the climate policy area. If you could skip the next slide and go straight to EV Hub. So one of the key signature products that we do to bring data to policymaking is make it accessible. We like to say we're trying to democratize access to data. So the smallest NGO or the smallest public agency has the same information access as big state, federal agencies and large companies. And we're doing that through EV Hub. If you're a public agency, you can sign up for free to access all the data that we've collected around the deployment of vehicles, the state of public policy, the state of investment, big subject we're talking about here today. But if you're not and you're a nonprofit or a private company, I think you'll find the cost of access to be quite low. It is single-handedly the largest community of people working on electric transportation across the country, something near over 1,200 users. So it's also a great network for you. can go on to the next one. So as I mentioned, I'm going to try to give a little background on electric transportation so we all understand how the state of the market is looking. It is very exciting time in EVs. You can see here our growth chart for passenger vehicle sales on a monthly basis over the last few years. It is trending upwards big time. We are having a record year in 2021, month over month sales records every month of the year so far. And I believe we've already surpassed all of the sales for 2020 as of August or September of 2021. So we're gonna have some big milestones when it comes to passenger vehicle sales, and a big reason for that is because the industry is introducing vehicles that consumers want. In the early days of EVs, we had passenger vehicles that were in some ways compliance vehicles. We call them compliance cars that were meant to just meet the standards required by California and some other state agencies. We've moved well past that. The technology has advanced considerably. The prices of batteries are down 80, 90% from the levels in 2010. And now we can see large vehicles of various utility being introduced at price points that are competitive with their conventional counterparts. And EVs are winning. And so this is a great time to be making considerable investments in infrastructure, which is the subject that we're going to be talking about today. Go on to the next one. And so let's give a little bit of a state of play on the investment. Where's the money coming from today? So people get some context for what this means for how much money is going to be going into infrastructure in the near term from the recently enacted infrastructure bill. So from a public funding perspective, we tracked a couple of $1 billion so far in electric vehicles across the country. So to give scale, what's coming out of Washington now is going to be unprecedented. We've also tracked from an investor-owned utility side over $3 billion of approved investments for all those investor-owned utilities around the country. Those investments could be for deploying charging infrastructure, deploying rebates for the stations, or delivering power to stations, consumer education programs, and other facets of advancing electric vehicles. Another huge investment is coming from the Volkswagen settlement. And so that includes lots of dollars, again, for charging infrastructure, but also for discounts and rebates on medium and heavy duty trucks. Industry, this you can see across the numbers, it dwarfs most of the other numbers on the screen here, and that's a good sign. We've tracked really hundreds of billions of dollars of committed investments overall across EVs globally, but only about 150 or so is slated for the United States today. And so when you think about that scale, that opportunity, that's jobs, that's economic development, and that's something that a better and improved policy framework here in the United States is going to attract more of those dollars to our country. And so that brings us to where we are today with the reconciliation bill and the bipartisan bill. These are huge investments, and I'm going to leave all the details to Tom later on. So as I mentioned, EVs right now, this is one of the single largest investment opportunities across the economy. We've tracked, $575 billion from automakers, truck manufacturers, and infrastructure providers around the globe. These are public press statements that we've been cataloging for years for EV Hub around how much money they're going to be pouring into the manufacturing, the design, the development of the vehicles and the batteries. But the US, we're only going to get $150 billion at that right now. And that's in part because the markets in Europe and China tend to be more attractive for purchasing the product. And so that's one of the key barriers we face right now. Not only do we have to make sure that it's a good place to do business in terms of building facilities and acquiring good talent to design, manufacture, and produce the vehicles, we also have to make sure it's a good market for acquiring the technology. A lot of vehicle manufacturers want to make their cars and assemble them near where they're sold. And so it's critically important as we move forward that we look at not just the opportunity for bringing more manufacturing here into the United States, but also ensuring that the demand for the product is within our borders as well. And just for some context, just recently, Ford pledged $11 billion in September to build EVs in Kentucky and in Shawnee State in Tennessee. That was the single largest investment in history for the state of Kentucky. This is a really, really big deal. We can go on to the next one. And so as we try to make it an attractive place to do business, we can see the ramp up of public investments. Clearly, we were a little bit late to the game in the United States in terms of making some of these commitments. 2015, under $50 million committed for EV deployment from public agencies, but that's growth has changed considerably. Major investments from the Federal Transit Administration, from the Volkswagen settlement, and other sources of funding have been pouring into EVs. But while these numbers look big, right? From a trends perspective, they're dwarfed by the investment numbers that are coming in from the private sector, and really what's going to be coming to us soon from the infrastructure bill, and if enacted, the Build Back Better Act that Tom will get into in just a moment. So to get our arms around the scale, we're throwing around huge numbers here, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars here or there. It's hard to wrap your head around, well, how much infrastructure are we actually talking about that's going to be needed in the States? We've done an analysis back in April on passenger vehicle deployment. In order to get to that sort of all electric future that a number of states, increasing number of states, have set out as targets, and that being 2035, having 100% EV sales, how much infrastructure do we need? We ran those numbers back in April and released them. And we pulled out the details for the states here that we're concerned with today. And you can see it's thousands of charging stations at the fast charging level and the level 2 charging level that's going to be needed over the next several years in order to set us up on the glide path. You have to have that infrastructure in place for the consumers to be expected to buy the vehicles. And so we need serious commitments from a capital perspective in order to make sure that we're going to be able to build that infrastructure over time. So this is a really, really big infrastructure challenge. We're not even talking here today about trucks, but we did actually just release our findings for a similar analysis for the electrification of trucks. And when we're talking infrastructure, it's not just delivering 5 kilowatts or 7 kilowatts of power to a level 2 station. We're talking a megawatt in some cases for trucks. So this is really big infrastructure, and it's going to be a very exciting several years in electric transportation here in the United States as we start to make those investments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for having us here today. I've got about 10 minutes, and the bill's together about a couple of thousand pages, so we're going to do our best to do a bit of a flyover and see what EV elements we have across the two bills. Just a couple of notes. One is that we have full summaries on our website, and I can drop the links to them in the chat afterwards about all the EV elements in both bills. If you want to get into how much is going to electric ferries, we have that that breakdown. The other thing is that this is a big new thing. There's a couple of thousand pages. The reconciliation bill, the latest draft, was released at the end of last week or mid last week, and so this is changing all the time. And if you have further insights, would love to hear them. But let's get into it. So we'll start with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So this was the bill passed on Friday, the bipartisan bill. We tracked $30.7 billion in EV eligible funding in this bill. So the way we sort of bucket that is $7.7 billion for EV dedicated funding, $12.7 billion for clean vehicles. So that's where EVs are eligible for funding, but the door is open to other fueling types, if you like, and then $10.3 billion for grid and batteries related to EVs. There's also a lot of other grid elements in the bill. So if we go through the next slide, we have a summary of the funding across the departments. And so you can see sort of the story here is that DOT and Department of Transport and Department of Energy hold big chunks of the money, as you might expect. And there are other agencies, support agencies that are listed in the bill, and there's other elements that have different lead agencies, but these are the funded elements in the bill. And yeah, Department of Transport is going to be very busy. We'll go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the Department of Transportation programs, the first one to highlight is $5 billion for the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program. So this funding is for states to deploy EV charging, for maintenance and infrastructure, to establish an interconnected network to facilitate that data collection, access, and reliability. The charging stations need to be along an FHA designated alternative fueling corridor, and states will develop a plan based on guidance from Department of Transport and Department of Energy. The next one is Fleet Transition Plan. Oh, sorry, we'll stay here. And I might keep moving quickly. So the Fleet Transition Plan, $4 billion. This is funding for buses. There is a 25% requirement that, to not go to zero emissions buses. So the rest of the funding is eligible for zero emissions buses. We have $2.5 billion in grants for charging and fueling infrastructure. There is a priority for rural areas, low and moderate income neighborhoods, and communities with low rates of private parking. And those are grants of up to $15 million. There's some port infrastructure development funding, and so $2.25 billion that includes funding for port electrification for drayage or medium and heavy duty trucks. We'll go to the next slide, please. So Department of Energy programs, so there's $3 billion for to enhance grid flexibility, including a note around vehicle to grid technologies, which is really exciting. There is a $6 billion bucket for battery processing and manufacturing. There are some smaller awards as part of that bucket, but the main two to look at is $3 billion for battery manufacturing and recycling, and then grants for battery material and processing. And then there's a $750 million allocation for the Advanced Energy Manufacturing and Recycling Program. Let's keep moving. So the next piece is a $5 billion for school buses. This is broken down into $2.5 billion for zero emissions buses, and then $2.5 billion for zero emissions or low emissions buses. So that this is one where electric buses can compete for that funding, but it's not dedicated for that purpose. And there's a priority for low-income, rural, and tribal schools for this funding. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. The Build Back Better Act. So the reconciliation bill, this is currently under negotiation. There's at least a stated intent to vote on it next week in the House. We've seen the text change in a big way over the past couple of months. The latest was released late last week, and is now a $1.75 billion top line. And there are some elements that have been trimmed down from our initial analysis, but the numbers that we've tracked is $209 billion for the package for EV elements, including about $24 billion for EV dedicated funding, $96 billion for EV eligible tax credits, and that estimate is taken from the Joint Committee on Taxation. We are all waiting with bated breath for the CBO score, but that is sort of a good interim number. And then there's $88 billion for EV eligible funding. So we'll go to the next slide. I think the main story here, when you break down who has the money, is to note that the EPA is going to be hugely busy if this thing passes, and a big part of that is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. But that's a lot of money to be flowing through the EPA, and then we have some usual players here with the Department of Energy, Department of Transport, and then of course Treasury. So we'll go through the next slide, please. I think probably we know this well, but it's worth starting with the EV tax credits. This is an expansion of the existing tax credit. It's a $4,500 tax expansion for union-made, domestic-made electric vehicles, $500 on top of that if more than 50% of the battery is made in the United States. The couple of other sort of things to know, and there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of detail, but from 2027, the existing $7,500 tax credit will only apply to US made vehicles. And that this tax is now, or is proposed to be refundable and transferable, which is pretty significant. There's also a used EV tax credit of up to $4,000 in this bill. Let's move to the next slide. We can talk more about this, but there is really key equity elements. I'll call out two here. One is in the broader $29 billion Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which includes $8 billion for projects in low-income or disadvantaged communities. And as part of that bucket, there's also $2 billion for EV charging equipment. And then there's also environmental and climate justice block grants, $3 billion there. And that, in scope there is funding for low and zero emissions technologies and infrastructure. So we'll go to the next slide, please. There's medium and heavy duty funding. This funding, the two pieces here for the EPA to purchase clean heavy duty vehicles, and then the EPA also to install zero emissions technology at ports, $3.5 billion. And of that money, $875 million has to be reserved for awards in non-attainment areas, so with poor air quality. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And then some funding for fleet electrification. So this again ties into some research that we put out about the opportunity with fleet electrification over the coming years. And this was trimmed back a little bit from the initial draft that was released of the reconciliation bill, at least in terms of the dedicated funding. So we see $3 billion in federal fleet electrification funding, and then also some more open-ended funding for the General Services Administration for clean technologies. And then there is $6 billion for the USPS to electrify their fleets, and more than half of that is for charging infrastructure, and then the rest of the money is for fleet and for other costs. And then we have $1 billion for zero emissions vehicle infrastructure grants, and of that $200 million is for hydrogen fueling, and the rest is for two buckets. One is for states to develop state programs, and then states to fund those programs. with an emphasis on underserved or disadvantaged communities. So we'll go to the next slide, and I'm almost done. So the timeline, to say it's not firm is sort of an understatement. We've seen the timeline move a lot. So this is sort of what we know at this point in time, but the Congress approved, or the House of Representatives approved the bill on Friday. We anticipate that President Biden will sign that next week. Also next week, the House plans to vote on the Build Back Better bill. And if it is approved, then it will go through to the Senate for a vote. Who knows when. So that's all I have, but I think our contact details are on the next slide. So feel free to get in touch if you have questions or if you want to chat more. Thanks.
Tom, Nick, thank you both very much for that overview. I am certain everybody has a lot of questions, and definitely encourage everybody to take advantage of the EV Hub as a great wealth of resources and information and insight, and kind of as you do your ongoing planning. Next, we're going to turn it over to Shauna Bass with Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. She's going to give us a little perspective on a state we've all seen in the news lately for, as the Atlas team pointed out, massive investments in that state, as well as a huge investment by the state legislature to advance EV opportunities in the state. So Shauna's going to give us a little insight on how this investment, how this opportunity fits into the already thriving landscape in Tennessee. So we'll turn it over to Shauna.
Awesome. Thank you, Wesley. And thank you, Tom and Nick, for your excellent information to kick us off. To set the stage for Tennessee and describe a little bit of the landscape surrounding our state energy office's collaboration with different partners, our Tennessee Department of Transportation, Tennessee Valley Authority, big names in our electric vehicle landscape right now. I do want to emphasize that in the past 5 years, we've been significantly expanding what we call our suite of energy and transportation projects. This is in part due to the fact that transportation is actually our #1 energy consuming end use sector in Tennessee and our largest GHG emissions sector when it comes to fossil fuel consumption. We do also have a lot of as a state energy office, a big role in the transportation sector because we've taken on responsibility for managing a few programs that are targeted at vehicles. So the Volkswagen Diesel Settlement Environmental Mitigation Trust, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with at this point. And recently, the US EPA's annual State Diesel Emissions Reduction Act program has come into our state energy office's hands in Tennessee. Both of those programs allow us to fund projects that target older diesel vehicles and equipment and seek to repower, replace, or otherwise enhance them to reduce diesel exhaust emissions and overall diesel fuel consumption where alternative fuels adoption is a possibility. In addition to that, I do also want to point out that our state energy office in Tennessee is also responsible for acting as coordinator for the Middle West Tennessee Clean Fuels Coalition. That's one of 2 Clean Cities coalitions in the state. And for those familiar with Clean Cities, you'll know that the Clean Cities Network spans across the country for local coalitions that are designated by the US Department of Energy to essentially fund a lot of technical assistance work, vehicle and fuel consumption tracking work when it comes to alternative fuels and advanced vehicle technologies. So we kind of have a suite of programs that we have been building in recent years that I think are really positioning us well to be able to leverage the funds that are incoming through this infrastructure bill with our partners across the state. There are certain key activities with our partners that have kind of catalyzed this closer engagement, particularly with our Tennessee Department of Transportation and the Tennessee Valley Authority. We worked together to compile nominations for alternative fuel corridor designations to the Federal Highway Administration. It's been a series of 5 rounds across the country where we in Tennessee did successfully designate all of our major interstates to being alternative fuel corridors, as well as a couple of US highways that were well positioned for that designation. because of those designations, we have unlocked the potential use of certain FHWA funds to support the implementation of related fueling infrastructure for alternative fuel corridors in general. That includes propane, compressed natural gas, and high-speed electric vehicle charging, DC fast charging. We are obviously working with our Department of Transportation, because they're the ones that implement those FHWA funds in the state, on working through the different types of programs that can support alternative fuel corridor equipment. Those include the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, CMAQ, as well as the Highway Infrastructure Program in recent years called HIP. And as Tom and Nick were talking through, a lot of the funds that are unlocked by this infrastructure bill will be funneled when it comes to like high-speed electric vehicle charging in the country. They're going to be funneled through some of those established FHWA programs, and therefore TDOT in our state will be likely the kind of primary candidate for organizing those funds, but hopefully with our partnership to help direct those funds where we need them. What you've been looking at right now is a map that we put together as a result of a collaboration, again, between our department, Department of Transportation, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and other members of our multi-stakeholder effort called Drive Electric Tennessee. Is comprised of not just the partners that I talked about before, but our Clean Cities Coalition members, different advocacy groups, manufacturing presences, including both the vehicles and the electric vehicle supply equipment, all sorts of different people coming together in a consortium to develop a shared plan and guiding principles for adopting electric vehicles in Tennessee. The goal is to have 200,000 electric vehicles registered in the state by 2028. After we kind of came together as a group, we did publish a statewide EV infrastructure needs assessment, which was conducted in 2019. And using the information from that needs assessment, which identified different charging use cases, where infrastructure needs to be placed, and where the private sector is more or less likely to develop or invest in, and therefore inform where public dollars need to be spent. Following that assessment, we put together the map that you're seeing here. It is called a EV infrastructure opportunity map that TDEC put together. And it shows you in green, might be hard to see on this webinar, but in green are our primary corridors. Those are our interstates, all of which, as I said, are designated as alternative fuel corridors. And in blue are our secondary corridors, which are select US and state highways that we're also prioritizing for electric vehicle fast charging investment. You can see placed on the map is existing DC fast charging infrastructure, as well as the placement of that infrastructure in relation to state parks locations, which Tennessee State Parks is based within my same department, Department of Environment and Conservation. And then economically distressed and at-risk counties as determined by the Appalachian Regional Commission on an annual basis. And those maps are kind of what first invited conversations between us and our partners at TDOT and TBA to begin developing some kind of program together that would address fast charging along the secondary and primary corridors you see here. But I do want to stop before we get too into that. Next slide, please. Another mapping effort that I think everyone needs to be aware of, not just limited to Tennessee, is one that was produced by the Southeast Regional Electric Vehicle Information Exchange, or Southeast REVI. And what you're seeing here is a product of that group that takes a more regional perspective on the same mapping exercise that you just saw that was limited to Tennessee, only this time it's really beefed up in the type of information that's included in the map. There's a lot of demographic and social equity concerns that are, census data that's been tracked in here, as well as other types of mapping data related to traffic along corridors, evacuation routes from the coasts in case of emergencies, all sorts of things that are worked into this map. And this map is available to the public to leverage more from a regional planning perspective on the placement of electric vehicle fast charging equipment and the gaps that we need to fill, hopefully with this infrastructure funding that's coming in, as well as other sources of funding that we have available to us. But I'm going to keep moving on just because I know I don't have a ton of time. I did also want to highlight that we here in Tennessee are very lucky to have an incredible investment from our local manufacturers and partnership between us and the Department of Environment and Conservation and our colleagues at the Department of Economic and Community Development. ECD actually did prepare these slides for us to show that, since 2017, there's been $11.9 billion in capital investment from EV projects in the state. That includes the 4 major OEMs that we'll talk about a little bit later that have made big investments and are already either producing electric vehicles in the state or investing in upgrading or completing manufacturing sites to be able to produce those vehicles relatively soon. Those projects employ nearly 19,000, more than 19,700 Tennesseans that are employed in the EV sector. There's 159,000 electric vehicles that have been manufactured in Tennessee since 2013, and we are #1 in the Southeast for electric vehicle manufacturing overall. One thing I do want to point out, our big investment comes from those big 4, but I do also don't want it to be missed that we do have great collaboration from more medium and large truck manufacturers that are either producing components or planning to produce vehicles in the future in the electric and hybrid vehicle market for those larger vehicles. Next slide, please. In 2021, all 4 Tennessee's OEMs, that includes GM in Spring Hill, Nissan in Smyrna, Chattanooga, Volkswagen, and then the newest investment opportunity from Ford in Memphis. They're all major manufacturers in the US, and they're all producing or plan to produce electric vehicles in the state. We claim 46% of the Southeast EV manufacturing jobs and 61% of EV manufacturing investment overall for our region. And we're home to either existing or soon to be existing lithium ion battery plants that will help supplant the need for that type of technology in the vehicle space. We do have, again, 16,000 electric vehicles built annually, and therefore, again, rank #1 in the Southeast for EV manufacturing. There might be one more slide if I'm remembering correctly. There we go. And in that same vein of economic investment, we also recognize that we need to have a similarly highly developed workforce for the proliferation of electric vehicle investment opportunities and just vehicle adoption that we anticipate to take place in the state. The Department of Environment and Conservation is working with several of our partners that includes ECD, TVA, our Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technologies, or TCATs, our partners at the Tennessee Board of Regents. There's many of us that are currently working to start this conversation on workforce development programs for electric vehicle and electric vehicle supply equipment service technicians, which we know is a huge burden to that could prevent us from scaling electric vehicles as fast as we would like to see. We need a skilled workforce that understands how to operate on these vehicles and reply to service issues with any of them, so that these vehicles continue to be an appealing opportunity for Tennesseans to adopt. I do want to point out that outside of the conversations that the state is having, we're already seeing partnerships between the OEMs that I mentioned before and their local academic universities and colleges. For instance, Volkswagen Academy is something that was based out of Chattanooga State Community College, I believe, and they there will train students to be able to work on essentially a Volkswagen manufacturing line. It does include some information on building green cars, from what I understand, but it's also just a general trade school program that's built into that community college. And we also know that our partners at the University of Memphis have been now in conversations with Ford to see what kind of programs they can develop to develop a skilled workforce for what Ford's for what Ford's needs will be. And a lot of that in the next few years is going to be manufacturing site development before the actual vehicles can even be produced. So we're seeing that the OEMs are very much looking for university and technical college partnerships in their area to build the workforce there that's going to be necessary for making the electric vehicle space as strong and skilled as possible. I think that's it for the slides that I have here prepared, but there's a few other things that I just want to chat about from Tennessee's perspective. When it comes to our current programming, the partnerships that I was talking about before with the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Tennessee Department of Transportation has resulted in us being able to release solicitation materials for a Fast Charge Tennessee network, which is going to be placing electric vehicle fast charging stations every 50 miles at least along the corridors that you saw highlighted in the slides before, with at least 2 to 4 charging stations at each location to help build up redundancy and higher than 50 kW standards to again ensure that we're future proofing these sites so that they're going to continue working for us for a long time. And the reason that we found that to be a good realm for us to invest our VW money, TVA to invest their dollars, and TDOT to continue assessing which FHWA funds make sense for them to also participate. We knew that as a result of the needs assessment that I mentioned earlier, that to have fast charging development, first of all, it's incredibly expensive, especially for some of these areas with rural development and not very many electric vehicles already in circulation. But it was also important that it was there because we know that range anxiety is a huge hurdle to electric vehicle adoption. And we also know that having this type of charging infrastructure accessible across the state will help us drive tourism to our rural destinations like the state parks, will help us make sure that there's access to those areas that are economically distressed or at risk. Those kinds of things all contributing to our decision to put a lot of funding toward this fast charge TN network. And this really does position us quite well to be able to continue to use funds from the infrastructure bill to help us fill in even more corridor gaps, as well as assess where other investments will be needed after public investment dollars from the Volkswagen diesel settlement and TVA have been used up on this kind of initial round of fast charging equipment. I think I don't want to go on because I know that I'm probably at my time limit here and I don't want to let anybody not have enough time. But I do want to point out when it comes to opportunities and hurdles for us that we see coming under the funding for the infrastructure bill, our primary concerns right now are with Buy America requirements as they are directed toward electric vehicle supply equipment. That's actually been a really big hurdle for our Department of Transportation in our state to be able to participate in the program very actively right now, just because the funding that they currently have from FHWA, the Buy America requirements on, X portion of all steel and different parts and components, part of the electric vehicle supply equipment itself needs to be sourced and made in the United States. That really is something that very much limits the type of infrastructure that would even be eligible to receive that kind of funding. And in Tennessee, other states, it is a state-by-state basis because your state office, FHWA office, is the one that gets to kind of determine, the Buy America compliance of the types of programs that are being designed. And we know that in Tennessee that continues to be a big hurdle for using these FHWA funds and committing them to those types of projects. And we anticipate that Buy America is going to continue to be a compliance requirement from the funds that are being delivered from the infrastructure bill. So I'll stop there and let it pass on to our Greenlabs folks. And I'm happy to take questions and participate in discussion later on today.
John, I appreciate the overview and detail on all the activities happening in Tennessee. Just very cognizant of time, I'm going to quickly turn it over to Josh Cohen, who is the policy director over at Greenlabs, who's going to give us a perspective on the private sector lens on the opportunities in the infrastructure bill.
Great, thanks, Wesley. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who are not familiar with Greenlabs, Greenlabs is an electric vehicle charging software and services company. Our core product is software. We can, depending on what our customers need, we can sell smart networked charging stations. We can do full turnkey installation. We can work with fleets on energy management. We can work with utilities to manage the load on the back end. Because our core product is software, it enables us to really focus on a lot of the energy management aspects related to EV charging. If you go to the next slide, please, the About Greenlabs slide. And then one more. Greenlabs was founded over 10 years ago as a startup in Los Angeles. We were acquired 2.5 years ago by Shell. We're now a member of Shell Renewables and Energy Solutions. Next slide, please. So for my 10 minutes, I have 4 pretty simple themes that are about how to think about the federal funding coming down and that are informed by Greenlabs' experience in the industry over the past decade. So next slide, please. So the first theme is operations and maintenance. A lot of this funding, if you remember back to the Obama era stimulus funding, the emphasis was on shovel-ready projects. And so states that were able to take advantage of that were able to get a bunch of infrastructure deployed, including some EV charging infrastructure. But one of the lessons learned from that deployment was that if you're not planning for and budgeting for ongoing operations and maintenance, you run the risk of being left with stations in disrepair that are unusable and does not support the type of driver or user experience we're all going for. And some of the programs that Tom mentioned in the infrastructure bill, the $2.5 billion competitive grant program specifically allows for 5 years of O&M funding in those grant applications. The $5 billion formula funding doesn't have a specific year in statute, but it does call for the guidance that DOT is going to be developing to allow for ongoing O&M. And one of the solutions that the industry overall has developed recently to fill in the gap between hardware, part replacement warranties, and software monitoring, which Greenlabs does, is to offer enhanced maintenance contracts so that if something happens with the station in the field, if the user interface panel is out, if it's just a screw that needs to be replaced, there's often uptime guarantees associated with these enhanced maintenance contracts. And again, that's all about the driver experience and how do we support a good driver and user experience as part of this transition. Next slide, please. So related to operations and maintenance is software. Software-enabled chargers unlock tremendous value. We could do a whole webinar just on software. Some of the things that software enables include visibility, data, who's charging, how are people charging, when are they charging. It allows the owner of the stations to set access and control who can charge, who gets to charge for free, how much do they pay, do we adjust the pricing depending on time of day. And importantly for Greenlabs, because we're built on a platform of open standards, open communication protocols, software enables interoperability. And that, similar to the theme of O&M on the previous slide, interoperability can minimize the risk of stranded assets. If you have a smart charger installed and you run into an issue with the software network provider, if that charger supports open communication protocols, you can swap out the software network provider and still have a usable asset. Otherwise, if you're locked into a particular software vendor with proprietary standards or that does not support transfer, you can have a physical charger in the ground and you're still not able to use it the way you want to. Next slide, please. A key aspect that software enables, a key value is the ability to manage load and associated costs. So I'm going to go through a few slides relatively quickly. If you go to the next slide, this is a conceptual illustration where you have 8 vehicles. They all come back to the depot, let's say at 12 noon, you can see at the bottom left. They all plug in, and then for that first hour, they're all charging. So that facility's load is basically providing full capacity to these eight chargers for that full hour. But if you look at those little circle icons, which represent when the vehicles depart, you'll see that some of these vehicles are there and plugged in for hours without charging. So from an energy management and cost management standpoint, is that the smartest and most efficient way to handle the charging? The answer is no. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how conceptually software can enable the fleet operator to plug in the preferences for each vehicle, what their priorities are, what their departure times are, and then the software in the background, the user can set it and forget it. The software can take care of optimizing load to ensure that when vehicles need to leave, they have a fully charged battery, but the facility owner on the back end is saving money. Next slide. So this slide is not conceptual. This slide is an actual, represents the load profile for an actual customer of Greenlabs. It's a depot with delivery vans. The problem that we worked to solve for the customer is that the local utility for this facility, the super peak rate is between 4 and 6 p.m. So briefly, the x-axis is 30-minute increments. It's the 24 hours in a day from midnight to midnight. The y-axis is load. The black lines, each of those black lines represents a daily load profile for that facility. The purple line represents peak load overall, and the green line represents the average load. So this is an after slide. I don't have the before slide, but if you let your eyes follow the green line, you can see how during the day the vehicles are out on their routes. They come back around 1500 hours, around 3 o'clock, they plug in, and you can see the trajectory of that green line just going exponentially upwards. And so our customer was paying a lot of money at super peak rate, which was undermining the whole economic value proposition of electrification in the first place. So working with Greenlabs and software, we were able to push down the load, allow the customer to save money during that 2-hour period, and then spread out the charging load over the evening hours. This is a real world example, and it's just one example of how software, regardless of the application, can help manage load and save money. Next slide, please. So these next two themes of planning and partnerships are kind of different types of themes. They really build on the previous presentations, in particular Tennessee's experience. So the first one is that planning is really critical for success for any number of reasons, but specifically as it relates to the infrastructure bill, a number of the programs either require or will offer advantage to applicants who have plans in place. One of the lessons learned from the Volkswagen settlement, which the EPA announced in September 2016, so just over 5 years ago, is that states that do not have planning processes in place lag behind the awarding and deployment of the funding. There are states, even today, where for the EV infrastructure piece of those VW funds, they still don't have a plan in place today. For some of them, it's political between the executive and legislative branch. Others, it's staff capacity, just because staff are overworked with so much going on in their bandwidth. And so the lesson learned from the VW settlement funding is that for states and like regional planning organizations, if you are not planning today to think about at a high level, what is your vision for EV charging? what do you want charging to look like? What are your goals? How do you, what's your roadmap to achieve those goals? If you're not doing that today, I encourage you to start right away and involve stakeholders and collaborators, which brings me to the next slide. Partnerships. So partnerships are key for any number of reasons. I want to highlight one piece on this slide, which is the importance of electric utility engagement for any number of reasons, both to help you as the plan developer, to help applicants, as well as to help the utility itself know what's going on. I want to offer one example, if you go to the next slide, of a really neat project that Greenlabs was involved in. Some of my colleagues on the West Coast. That blurry truck in this picture is a fully battery electric Class 8 freight truck, one of the very first that Volvo brought to market in the US. Volvo Lights, if you go to the next slide, is a government funded program. It's not federal funding, but it's a type of program, particularly when you look at some of the programs in the infrastructure bill. It's the type of program that I believe could easily be funded by federal infrastructure dollars. The whole focus around Volvo Lights is to improve air quality and reduce emissions related to port drayage operations around the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And to the equity and the Justice 40 aspects, really to help improve air quality in these overburdened commercial and industrial and low-income neighborhoods where the freight is moving. So it involved 16 organizations. It involved a couple community and technical colleges to develop workforce curriculum. It involved Greenlabs as the infrastructure provider. It involved shipping and logistics companies, certainly the electric utility. So there are models for how to do innovative partnerships. The key behind this is it was a $90 million project. California's climate investments is funding about half of it. So for projects that really require some sort of financial support, Greenlabs views the federal infrastructure bill as really providing significant opportunity. So I believe that concludes my presentation. I appreciate your time and for including Greenlabs, and I look forward to the remaining discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. And thanks to all of our panelists. I'm just going to call attention to the fact we are 3 minutes to the top of the hour, and I know folks need to drop because there's middle of the workday. So we do not have adequate time to address a number of pressing questions that follow on with these presentations. Chief among them that Josh was just highlighting, how are we going to do this equitably? There's a lot of questions of, well, what does equity even mean in this context? How do you plan for it? How do you measure it? And then what are the right strategies to implement equitable planning practices to ensure equitable outcomes for all of this investment opportunity? And another element they also spoke to is workforce. This is not just going to be hugely transformative for our roads and our transportation infrastructure, but this is going to completely remake the landscape of jobs across the South, and planning and figuring out the pipeline for how we're getting the workforce ready and how we're transforming our community colleges and our tech schools and our four-year institutions to be a pipeline of equitable opportunity to the jobs it's going to create is a whole other kettle of fish that we're going to have to unpack, and that Sia is very interested in talking more about. So we're going to be committed to making additional space for those conversations about how to plan for equity and how to plan for workforce, and we're going to be putting together some forums and future conversations on that, and we'll hope you'll join us for those. But for now, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I just want to take the opportunity to thank Nick, Tom, Shauna, and Josh for being with us today. Highly encourage our listeners to follow up, read some more of their resources. We will be sending out a recording of this presentation along with all of the slides they presented to us. Definitely encourage you to check out the EV Hub. And please, as you noted in the chat, please take advantage of our survey. We'd love to hear how we did during the session, what you'd like to hear more about, and what else we can do to be a resource for the region. I want to thank all of our attendees. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate all the work you're doing for the region. And we look forward to working with you further to make the most of this historic investment coming into the South. And with that, we will close out. Thank you all again for attending. Thank you to our speakers. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.